The moment this broke, it changed the entire direction of the Iran nuclear story, and almost no one is explaining why. Early this morning, reports confirmed that Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi landed in St. Petersburg for a high-stakes meeting with Vladimir Putin. Within hours, the Kremlin, through spokesman Dmitry Peskov, made something very clear. Russia's offer to take custody of Iran's enriched uranium is still on the table. Not a rumor, not speculation, but a standing, active proposal. And then came the line that should stop you in your tracks. It has not been acted upon. 4 simple words that reveal a massive geopolitical standoff most people are completely missing, because what is happening beneath the surface is far more significant. For months, the United States has repeated one core demand in every negotiation, every back-channel conversation, every diplomatic signal. Iran must get rid of its enriched uranium. Not reduce it, not freeze it, but remove it. We are talking about roughly 450 kilograms enriched up to 60% material that can be pushed to weapons grade in a matter of weeks, enough for multiple nuclear weapons. This is not just another condition on a long list. This is the condition. Every ceasefire discussion, every round of indirect talks, every political message ultimately circles back to this single non-negotiable requirement. Now, out of nowhere, Russia steps in with a solution that on paper solves everything. Moscow is essentially saying, give us the uranium, we will take it out of Iran, store it on Russian soil, and reprocess it under international supervision. Iran keeps its nuclear infrastructure. The dangerous material leaves the country, and the global community, including watchdogs like the International Atomic Energy Agency, can monitor the entire process. No war, no strikes, no escalation, a diplomatic off-ramp that avoids a global crisis. But here is the twist, the part no one can ignore. This deal, the one that checks every major box, was rejected. And that raises the real question driving everything. If a solution exists that prevents conflict, satisfies the core demand, and stabilizes the region, why was it turned down? Let's be direct. Donald Trump rejected Vladimir Putin's offer to take custody of Iran's enriched uranium. This is not speculation. It was confirmed through reporting where a U.S. official stated plainly that it had not been accepted. On the surface, Washington's position sounds reasonable. They keep repeating that the uranium must be secured, but what is often left unsaid is the real divide. The United States agrees with the goal but rejects the method. They want the uranium out of Iran, just not in Russian hands. And that distinction, small on paper but enormous in reality, is the entire story unfolding right now. Because while Washington hesitates, Abbas Araghchi boards a plane and flies straight to St. Petersburg to meet Putin. That is not routine diplomacy. That is a signal. Iran is effectively responding. If America will not accept Russia as the solution, then we will engage Russia directly anyway. And to understand why this moment matters, you have to go back years, to the foundation of this entire issue. Under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the deal the United States withdrew from in 2018, Russia already played this exact role. Iran shipped out around 97% of its enriched uranium stockpile, and it went to Russia. It was handled by Rosatom, stored, processed, and monitored under international oversight. And the key point is this: it worked. There were no major violations, no diversion of material, and no breakdown in verification. The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed compliance for years until the U.S. exited the agreement and sanctions returned. So when the Kremlin says today that Russia is the only country with real experience handling Iran's uranium, it is not propaganda. It is a documented precedent. The system already existed and functioned. Russia has the infrastructure, the legal framework, the storage capability, and the operational relationship with the IAE to do it again almost immediately. Even nuclear industry officials have said the transfer is technically feasible, and the coordination mechanisms for monitoring already exist. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question: why reject it? The answer has less to do with uranium itself and more to do with power. Washington's concern, based on reporting, is that allowing Russia to manage and process Iranian uranium would strengthen Moscow's position in the global nuclear fuel market. Rosatom already plays a dominant role in enrichment and nuclear services worldwide. If Russia takes Iran's stockpile and processes it, it increases its leverage across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. For the United States, which has been trying to reduce dependence on Russian nuclear supply chains, that is a strategic setback. That concern is not irrational. It is a geopolitical calculation. but it comes with consequences. By rejecting Russia as the custodian, the United States is effectively demanding that Iran give up its uranium through channels that avoid benefiting Russia. The problem is those alternative channels are extremely limited in practice, and in reality, Iran is highly unlikely to hand over its uranium directly to the United States. It is just as unlikely to trust U.S. allies like France or Japan with that material, and the idea of destroying the uranium inside Iran would require a level of cooperation and trust that simply does not exist. What you are left with is a paradox. The U.S. wants the uranium gone. Russia offers a proven way to remove it. Iran is willing to talk about it. But because of who controls the solution, not what the solution achieves, the deal stalls. And that is exactly why today's meeting in St. Petersburg matters far more than it appears on the surface. So where does that leave the United States right now? In a position far more constrained than it looks. By rejecting Vladimir Putin's uranium proposal, Washington has effectively boxed itself into a corner. The only mechanism on the table that has actually worked before, the only one with a proven track record, has already been dismissed. And while American officials search for an alternative that does not currently exist, one critical fact remains unchanged: Iran's enriched uranium stays inside Iran. That means the pressure campaign continues, instability in global energy markets persist, oil prices remain elevated, and the broader conflict drags on without a clear off-ramp. Now look at Araghchi's move in that context. His flight to St. Petersburg is not just diplomacy, it is strategy. Iran understands exactly the position the U.S. has put itself in. Tehran knows Washington rejected the Russian mechanism. It knows there is no ready substitute. And most importantly, it knows that without resolving the uranium issue, the United States cannot bring this crisis to an end on its own terms. So instead of waiting, Iran is leaning into the one channel that still exists: Russia. Araghchi reinforced this when speaking to Iranian state media, describing the visit as a good opportunity for consultations with Moscow and stressing that these discussions are especially important at this stage. That phrase carries weight. At this stage signals urgency, timing, and leverage. It is not routine coordination. It is a moment where the balance of influence is shifting. Talks are stalled, Washington is hesitating, and the uranium issue remains unresolved. In that vacuum, Russia's role does not shrink, it expands, because, as Dmitry Peskov confirmed, the offer is still there. The mechanism exists, and by physically showing up in Russia, Iran is sending a message without saying it outright. The solution is available, operational, and waiting, but the United States chose not to use it. At the same time, Iran is ensuring that if Washington eventually shifts position, or if pressure increases from global markets and allies dependent on stability and choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, the infrastructure for a deal is already in place. Now add China into this equation. What Beijing is not saying is just as important as what Moscow is saying. Before Araghchi even boarded his flight, he spoke with Wang Yi. That call happened before wider regional consultations showing early visibility into Iran's thinking. Yet China has remained completely silent publicly. No statement on the visit, no reaction to the uranium proposal, no positioning at all. But silence does not mean absence. China's strategic ties with Iran run deep, including long-standing energy cooperation and reported links in military technology supply chains. Just days earlier, China and Russia held talks with the International Atomic Energy Agency focused on Iran's nuclear program. That meeting occurred only days before Araghchi arrived in St. Petersburg. The timing suggests coordination rather than coincidence. The IAEA discussion looks like preparation, while today's meeting looks like execution. And China remains in a quiet observing role, holding economic leverage while avoiding public exposure, which brings us back to the structural problem facing the United States. This is not just a diplomatic disagreement, it is a strategic trap. Washington needs Iran's uranium removed. Russia has the capability and experience to do it. The U.S. rejected that pathway, and right now there is no alternative Iran is willing to accept. That leaves two options: eventually reconsider the Russian mechanism or pursue a far riskier route involving direct intervention. There have even been discussions and reporting about special operations forces securing nuclear material inside Iran. But that is not diplomacy, it is escalation. It risks breaking any ceasefire framework, requires extreme operational complexity, and could trigger Iranian retaliation that expands the conflict unpredictably. It is a scenario with too many variables to control. So this is the reality at this moment. As Araghchi sits across from Putin in St. Petersburg, the only peaceful mechanism that could remove Iran's uranium is the one offered by Russia and rejected by the United States. The alternative path involves force with all the risks that come with it. Meanwhile, maritime tensions rise, economic pressure builds, and the diplomatic window continues to narrow. And then there is the most revealing detail. Donald Trump himself described the uranium issue as 99% of the deal. That framing was echoed by J.D. Vance. So if the uranium question is effectively the entire agreement, and the only workable solution has already been rejected, then the United States has effectively blocked its own path to a deal. Not a minor setback, but the core of the process itself, and that is exactly why Araghchi is in St. Petersburg today, Vladimir Putin right now. This meeting is not about deciding whether Russia will take custody of the uranium. That part has already been signaled. It is about the fine print, timelines, verification structures with the International Atomic Energy Agency, technical safeguards, and most importantly, guarantees that Russia cannot simply turn around and use that material to expand its dominance in the global nuclear fuel market. And here is the key insight. Those are solvable problems. They are not existential geopolitical barriers. They are engineering, legal, and regulatory questions that can be negotiated, structured, and enforced. Iran is in Russia precisely because the bigger strategic question is already settled. Russia is willing, Iran is open, the IAEA can oversee it. The only missing piece is approval from Washington. To be fair, there is a counter-argument, and it is not trivial. The concern is that Russia is not acting out of goodwill. Putin is not offering to take Iran's uranium as a favor to the international community. He is doing it because it gives Moscow leverage. It strengthens Russia's position in the global nuclear fuel chain and increases its influence in any post-conflict Middle East arrangement. From Washington's perspective, that is a strategic gain for a rival power. That skepticism is grounded in real geopolitical competition, but the critical question is not whether Russia benefits. It is whether the alternative is better, because the alternative is what is unfolding right now, a prolonged blockade, a ceasefire that exists more on paper than reality, rising tensions in key trade routes like the Strait of Hormuz, elevated oil prices affecting global markets, and most importantly, Iran's enriched uranium still sitting inside the country, unchanged and unresolved. When you compare those outcomes, the cost of rejecting the Russian mechanism begins to look heavier than the cost of limiting Moscow's influence. That is the calculation that has been made, and it is exactly why Araghchi is in St. Petersburg today, while Washington waits for another solution to appear. What comes next is likely not broad negotiation, but refinement. Russia is expected to present a more detailed version of its custody proposal, with clearer timelines for transfer, stricter storage conditions, structured IAEA oversight, and most importantly, explicit limits on what Russia can do with the material once it is transferred. That final point is the core of the U.S. objection, concerns about resale, reprocessing, and market leverage. If these updated guarantees are strong enough to prevent Russia from converting the uranium into a broader geopolitical asset, then the central U.S. concern is at least partially addressed. From there, the process becomes diplomatic transmission. Araghchi carries the framework back to Tehran. It moves through regional channels and eventually returns to Washington. At that point, the decision becomes unavoidable. Accept the mechanism or reject it again. If it is accepted, the implications are immediate. The uranium issue, described as 99% of the deal, is resolved. Pressure on global shipping routes eases. A pathway toward de-escalation opens. If it is rejected again, the consequences are equally clear. The conflict continues, and the diplomatic record becomes increasingly defined by a pattern. Iran signaled willingness. Russia offered a mechanism, and the United States declined. That narrative matters. It shapes alliances, influences global perception, and affects how future negotiations are framed. Meanwhile, China remains quiet, but not absent. Beijing offers no public statements or visible pressure, but continues purchasing Iranian oil, giving Tehran economic space to maneuver. It is also engaged in broader discussions with Russia and the IAEA on Iran's nuclear issue. China operates as a stabilizing background force, not by speaking loudly, but by ensuring Iran has the ability to wait. In that sense, China is shaping the environment without stepping into the spotlight. And that quiet presence is part of what allows Iran to sit in St. Petersburg today, actively engaging while the most critical diplomatic question of the moment remains unresolved. Russia is moving in parallel rather than rushing to respond to Washington. And that brings us back to the simplest, most revealing image of this entire situation. Donald Trump said there is a phone, a line of communication, a path forward, but that phone has not rung. Instead, Arakchi is sitting across from Putin discussing a mechanism that already exists, while the country that needs that mechanism most has still not accepted it. Now add another layer, because this may be one of the most important pieces of the entire puzzle, and it goes far beyond uranium. In January 2025, just weeks before tensions escalated, Iran and Russia signed a 20-year strategic partnership agreement. This was not symbolic diplomacy. It was a deep framework covering economic cooperation, military coordination, and long-term political alignment. It stopped short of a formal defense pact, but its level of integration is still significant. So when Abbas Arakchi arrives in St. Petersburg to meet Vladimir Putin, he is not entering as a negotiator seeking external help. He is arriving as a representative of a treaty partner coordinating with an aligned power. That distinction changes the interpretation entirely. This is not Russia stepping in as a neutral mediator. This is Russia engaging with a long-term strategic partner already tied through formal agreements. Which means the conversation behind closed doors is not just can Russia help solve this, but rather how both sides position themselves within the crisis to maximize outcomes. Because Russia's interests here are not abstract, they are concrete and measurable. During recent tensions, especially around disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, global oil prices rose and Russia's energy revenues increased significantly, with reports indicating hundreds of millions of euros per day during peak periods. That is not incidental, it is structural. When global supply tightens and prices rise, Russia benefits directly. So the longer instability continues, the more financially advantageous the situation becomes for Moscow. Now place that against Dmitry Peskov's statement that the uranium offer still stands. On the surface, it appears constructive and solution-oriented, but beneath that is a deeper strategic question. Does Russia prefer rapid stabilization that ends its windfall, or a prolonged crisis where it remains the indispensable actor offering solutions while continuing to benefit from instability? This is not about assuming bad faith, it is about incentives. Russia's position allows it to win in multiple scenarios. If the deal is accepted, Moscow becomes custodian of Iranian nuclear material, strengthens its role in the global nuclear fuel market, and gains diplomatic credit as a crisis resolver. If the deal is rejected, it still benefits from high energy prices and from growing pressure on U.S. credibility as the situation remains unresolved. Zoom out further, and China fits into a similar structure. Beijing, through figures like Wang Yi, has remained publicly quiet, but its strategic posture is clear. China benefits from continued access to Iranian energy, often on favorable terms. It benefits from instability that weakens Western leverage in global markets. And it benefits from a situation where the United States struggles to finalize its own stated objectives. China does not need loud declarations to shape outcomes. Its influence operates through continuity. By maintaining economic ties with Iran and coordinating at key moments with Russia and international institutions like the IAEA, Beijing helps create conditions where Iran can afford to wait, reducing urgency while increasing pressure on Washington. So St. Petersburg is not just about uranium. It is a convergence point of long-term partnerships, economic incentives, and geopolitical positioning. Iran is coordinating with a treaty partner. Russia is balancing influence with opportunity. China is shaping the background environment, and the United States is attempting to achieve a stated objective without a functioning mechanism that all parties will accept. That is why this moment matters, not only for what is being discussed, but for what it reveals about leverage, delay, and control. What is unfolding is not just a diplomacy issue. It is a structural strategy problem where each actor is responding according to incentives that do not fully align. Russia is moving in parallel rather than rushing to respond to Washington, and that brings us back to the simplest, most revealing image of this entire situation. Donald Trump said there is a phone, a line of communication, a path forward, but that phone is not rung. Instead, Arakchi is sitting across from Putin discussing a mechanism that already exists, while the country that needs that mechanism most has still not accepted it. Now add another layer, because this may be the most important piece of the puzzle, and it goes far beyond uranium. In January 2025, just weeks before tensions escalated, Iran and Russia signed a 20-year strategic partnership agreement. This was not symbolic diplomacy. It was one of the most comprehensive bilateral frameworks either country has entered in modern history, covering economic cooperation, military coordination, and deep political alignment. It deliberately stopped short of a formal mutual defense pact, but the level of integration is still significant, so when Abbas Araghchi lands in St. Petersburg to meet Vladimir Putin, he is not walking in as a negotiator seeking outside help. He is arriving as a representative of a treaty partner, coordinating strategy with an aligned power. That distinction changes the interpretation completely. This is not Russia stepping into a foreign conflict as a neutral mediator. This is Russia being consulted, briefed, and potentially aligned through long-term commitments already in place. Which means the conversation behind closed doors is not simply about whether Russia can help solve the crisis. It is about how both sides position themselves within it to maximize outcomes. Because Russia's interests are not abstract, they are concrete, measurable, and in many ways profitable. During recent tensions, especially disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz, global oil prices rose and Russia's energy revenues surged significantly, with reports indicating hundreds of millions of euros per day at peak periods. That is not incidental. That is structural. When global supply tightens and prices rise, Russia benefits. So the longer instability continues, the more financially advantageous the situation becomes for Moscow. Now place that alongside Dmitry Peskov's statement that the uranium offer still stands. On the surface, it looks like a constructive solution, but underneath the strategic question remains, does Russia prefer a rapid resolution that reduces its windfall, or a prolonged situation where it remains the indispensable problem solver while benefiting from ongoing instability? This is not about assuming bad faith, it is about incentives. Russia's position allows it to win in multiple scenarios. If the deal is accepted, Moscow becomes custodian of Iran's nuclear material, expands its role in the global nuclear fuel market, and gains diplomatic credit as a crisis resolver. If it is rejected, Russia still benefits from high energy prices and from rising pressure on U.S. credibility as the conflict remains unresolved. Zooming out makes the pattern even clearer. China's position mirrors this dynamic in its own way. Beijing, through figures like Wang Yi, has remained publicly silent, but its strategic posture is visible. China benefits from continued access to Iranian energy, often under favorable terms. It benefits from disruptions that weaken Western influence in global markets, and it benefits from a geopolitical environment where the United States struggles to enforce or finalize its stated objectives. China does not need to dominate headlines to shape outcomes. Its influence works quietly. By maintaining economic ties with Iran and coordinating at key moments with Russia and the International Atomic Energy Agency, China helps create conditions where Iran can afford to wait, reducing urgency for Tehran while increasing pressure on Washington. So St. Petersburg is not just a uranium discussion. It is a convergence of long-term partnerships, economic incentives, and geopolitical positioning. Iran is coordinating with a treaty partner. Russia is balancing influence with opportunity. China is shaping the environment from the background. And the United States is trying to navigate all of this while holding a position that currently lacks a workable mechanism to achieve its stated goal. That is why this moment matters. Not only for what is being discussed, but for what it reveals about leverage, delay, and control. What is unfolding is not just a diplomacy problem. It is a strategy problem where each actor is moving according to incentives that do not fully align.